In 1981, a respected pediatric nurse from a small mountain town in Colorado vanished without a trace. The morning mist still clung to the pine trees when Sarah Martinez kissed her 9-year-old daughter Elena goodbye, watching through the kitchen window as the child skipped down the cobblestone path toward the village bakery. The sun painted golden streaks across the asphalt, and Elena's red backpack bounced rhythmically against her small frame as she hummed a church hymn her mother had taught her the night before. The distance to Miller's bakery was barely 3 blocks through the safest neighborhood in Cedar Falls, a place where children played until sunset and doors remained unlocked. Sarah turned back to her morning coffee, never imagining that glimpse of red fabric disappearing around the corner would be the last time she'd see her daughter alive. The bakery owner, Mrs. Miller, would later tell the police that Elena never arrived that morning. By noon, when Sarah called the school to ask why Elena hadn't shown up for classes, panic began to creep into her voice like ice water through her veins. The entire town of Cedar Falls mobilized within hours. Search parties combed through every forest trail, every abandoned barn, every hidden creek where a child might have wandered and gotten lost. Father Mackenzie led prayer vigils in the small Catholic church, while volunteers plastered Elena's school photo on every telephone pole and storefront window. The FBI arrived from Denver, their black sedans stark against the pastoral landscape, interviewing everyone who had seen the girl in her final days. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks dissolved into months of agonizing uncertainty. Sarah's husband, Miguel, took leave from his job at the local hospital to join the search efforts, his hands growing calloused from turning over every stone, his voice hoarse from calling Elena's name through the mountain valleys. The community held fundraisers and organized search parties that extended far beyond Cedar Falls, reaching into neighboring counties where hope flickered like dying embers. Local news crews arrived and departed, their cameras capturing the grief etched into Sarah's face and the growing desperation in Miguel's eyes. The case file grew thick with dead-end leads and false sightings, each one a cruel reminder that their daughter had simply vanished into thin air. Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow that made further searches impossible. The FBI scaled back their investigation, leaving behind a community forever changed by the loss of innocence and the weight of unanswered questions. Sarah returned to work at the hospital, though colleagues noticed how she would pause at the pediatric ward, staring at children Elena's age with a mixture of love and unbearable sorrow. Miguel began attending Mass more frequently, his faith becoming both an anchor and a source of torment as he struggled to understand why God would allow such suffering. The red backpack Elena had carried that morning was never found, becoming a symbol of everything that remained lost and unexplained. As 1982 dawned, Cedar Falls tried to move forward, but Elena's disappearance had left an invisible scar across the town's collective soul. Missing person posters faded and peeled away from walls, replaced by newer tragedies and different headlines. But Sarah and Miguel's kitchen window remained unchanged. Every morning, Sarah would stand in the same spot where she had watched Elena skip away, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she stared at the empty path, the house filled with the ghosts of what might have been. Birthday parties never thrown, school plays never attended, wedding dresses never worn. In the deepest corners of their hearts, both parents carried the terrible knowledge that their daughter's story had ended before it had barely begun, leaving them to wonder if she had suffered, if she had called for them, if somewhere in the vast wilderness surrounding their small town, Elena's bones lay waiting to be found. 30 years later, Detective Marcus Rivera sat in his Denver office, watching the autumn rain streak down the window as he prepared for retirement. The son of Miguel Martinez, he had spent his entire career in law enforcement, driven by the ghost of his younger sister, a shadow that had shaped every case he'd worked and every criminal he'd pursued. His father had died 5 years earlier, his heart finally succumbing to decades of grief and unanswered questions, while his mother Sarah remained in the same house in Cedar Falls, now a frail woman in her 70s who still set 2 plates for dinner out of habit. Marcus had grown up in the aftermath of Elena's disappearance, watching his parents' marriage crumble under the weight of loss, their faith in God and humanity slowly eroding like sandcastles before an incoming tide. The badge he wore felt heavy, on his chest, a constant reminder of his failure to solve the one case that mattered most. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in October 2011, delivered to Sarah's house by a postal worker who noticed the absence of a return address. Sarah's arthritis-gnarled fingers trembled as she tore open the manila envelope, her heart lurching when she saw the contents. Elena's red backpack, somehow preserved despite 3 decades of Colorado weather. Inside the bag, wrapped in a plastic evidence bag, was Elena's small diary, a gift Sarah had given her for her 9th birthday, just 2 weeks before the disappearance. The diary's purple cover was stained and weathered, but the pages inside remained legible, filled with Elena's careful handwriting and innocent observations about school, friends, and the church activities she loved. The final entry, dated the morning of her disappearance, contained words that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Father Mackenzie said he has a special job for me today. He said God needs me to help with something important. Marcus drove to Cedar Falls that same afternoon, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white as he absorbed the implications of his sister's final words. Father Mackenzie had been the town's beloved priest for over 40 years, a man who had comforted the Martinez family during their darkest hours and had led the community in prayer for Elena's safe return. The priest was now in his 80s, retired and living in a small apartment behind the church, his mind still sharp despite his advanced age. As Marcus read through Elena's diary in his mother's kitchen, he noticed other troubling entries from the weeks before her disappearance, mentions of special meetings with Father Mackenzie, references to secret missions that only she was chosen for, and disturbing drawings of a man in black robes standing over a small figure. The innocent trust in Elena's words made Marcus's stomach turn, and he felt the familiar fire of justice burning in his chest. The local police department had changed dramatically since 1981, with most of the original investigators retired or deceased, leaving behind boxes of evidence stored in a basement that smelled of mildew and forgotten dreams. Marcus used his credentials to access Elena's case file, discovering inconsistencies and gaps in the investigation that made him question whether the truth had been deliberately obscured. Several witness statements mentioned seeing Elena talking to a man in a black sedan near the church on the morning of her disappearance, but these leads had never been properly followed up. Phone records from the church showed multiple calls to unknown numbers in the days surrounding Elena's disappearance, but the investigating officers had accepted Father Mackenzie's explanation that they were routine church business. Most disturbing of all, Marcus found a note in the case file indicating that the FBI had been instructed to scale back their investigation after receiving pressure from local religious authorities. That evening, Marcus sat across from his mother in the same kitchen where Elena had eaten her last breakfast, watching Sarah's face as she processed the horrifying possibility that their family's spiritual guide might have been responsible for her daughter's disappearance. The woman who had once found solace in prayer now looked at the crucifix on the wall with suspicion and fear. 30 years of faith beginning to crack like ice on a frozen pond. Marcus reached across the table and took his mother's hand, feeling the papery texture of her skin and the slight tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. "I'm going to find out what happened to Elena," he promised, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of guilt and determination. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows of the house where time had stood still since 1981. And somewhere in the distance, the church bells of Cedar Falls began to toll, a sound that no longer brought comfort, but instead seemed to carry the echo of long-buried secrets. The basement of St. Mary's Church smelled of old wood and forgotten prayers, its stone walls holding decades of whispered confessions and hidden truths. Marcus descended the narrow stairs with a flashlight, his mother's spare key to the church, feeling like a betrayal in his pocket, though he knew that finding Elena's killer justified any trespass. The church records were kept in metal filing cabinets that lined the basement walls, their locks rusted with age and neglect. And as Marcus pried open the first cabinet, he discovered financial documents that painted a disturbing picture of Father Mackenzie's tenure. Bank statements showed large cash deposits throughout the early 1980s, money that had no corresponding documentation or explanation in the church's official records. Purchase orders revealed expensive renovations to the priest's private quarters, including soundproofing materials and basement modifications that seemed excessive for a small mountain parish. Most damning of all, Marcus found insurance policies, taken out on several church properties just weeks before Elena's disappearance, policies that had been quietly canceled after the investigation died down. The next morning, Marcus visited the Cedar Falls Library, where librarian Mrs. Patterson had worked for over 50 years and remembered every significant event in the town's history. Her wrinkled hands shook as she pulled out archived newspaper clippings from 1981, pointing to articles Marcus had never seen before. Stories about other missing children from neighboring towns, all of them last seen near Catholic churches, all of their cases closed without resolution. Mrs. Patterson's voice dropped to a whisper as she revealed that she had tried to bring these connections to the attention of the FBI in 1981, but had been dismissed as a hysterical old woman prone to conspiracy theories. The librarian's eyes filled with tears as she described how she had been warned by church officials to stop spreading rumors that could damage the community's faith and reputation. In a manila folder hidden behind outdated reference books, she showed Marcus photographs from church events throughout the 1980s, images that showed Father Mackenzie consistently positioning himself next to young children, his hands always resting on their shoulders in a gesture that now seemed predatory rather than paternal. Marcus spent the afternoon at the county courthouse, using his law enforcement connections to access sealed records and juvenile case files that had been buried for decades. The pattern emerged like a photograph developing in a darkroom: reports of inappropriate behavior by Father Mackenzie dating back to the 1970s. Complaints that had been quietly settled by the Catholic diocese and covered up by a network of officials who prioritized institutional reputation over child safety. 3 families had attempted to bring charges against the priest in the years before Elena's disappearance, but their cases had been dismissed due to lack of evidence or intimidation by church lawyers. Marcus found depositions describing Father Mackenzie's special mentorship programs for selected children, private meetings held in the church basement where he claimed to be teaching them about faith and service to God. The most chilling document was a letter from the diocese to Father Mackenzie, dated just 1 week before Elena's disappearance, warning him that his methods were under scrutiny and that he needed to be more discreet in his pastoral activities. That evening, Marcus confronted his mother with the evidence he had gathered, watching her face crumble as the full scope of Father Mackenzie's deception became clear. Sarah sat in her favorite chair, Elena's diary clutched to her chest, as Marcus explained how the priest had likely used his position of trust to lure children into dangerous situations. The photographs from the library showed Elena at multiple church events, always positioned close to Father Mackenzie, her innocent smile radiating the trust that had ultimately led to her destruction. Sarah's voice was barely audible as she recounted how she had encouraged Elena to spend time with the priest, how she had been proud that her daughter was chosen for special responsibilities at the church. The weight of unwitting complicity settled on both mother and son like a shroud, and Marcus realized that Father Mackenzie had not only stolen Elena's life, but had also weaponized their family's faith against them. The wind howled through the mountains that night, rattling the windows of the Martinez house as Marcus made plans to confront Father Mackenzie the next morning. He cleaned his service weapon with methodical precision, his hands steady despite the rage burning in his chest, and he thought about the justice that had been denied to Elena and countless other children. The diary lay open on the kitchen table, its pages filled with a 9-year-old's trust and excitement about serving God, words that now read like a suicide note written in innocence and ignorance. Marcus looked at his mother, seeing how the revelation had aged her overnight, and he made a silent promise that before the sun set again, Father Mackenzie would face the consequences of his actions. Outside, the church bells tolled midnight, their sound carrying across the valley like a funeral dirge for the faith that had died in this house 30 years ago. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghost of Elena Martinez waited for justice to finally arrive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the church parking lot as Marcus approached Father Mackenzie's small apartment, his badge giving him the authority to demand answers, but his heart providing the courage to face the monster who had destroyed his family. The elderly priest answered the door in his bathrobe, his once commanding presence now diminished by age and the weight of hidden sins, though his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had allowed him to evade justice. For decades, Marcus showed him Elena's diary and watched as recognition flickered across the priest's weathered face, followed by a brief moment of what might have been genuine remorse before his expression hardened into the mask of righteous authority he had worn for so many years. "I wondered when someone would finally come asking the right questions," Father Mackenzie said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he had used during countless sermons, as if he were discussing theology rather than child murder. The admission hung in the air between them like smoke, and Marcus felt his hand instinctively move toward his weapon as he realized he was standing face to face with his sister's killer. Father Mackenzie invited Marcus inside, pouring coffee with steady hands as he began to weave a narrative that mixed truth with manipulation, confession with justification. He described Elena as a special child who had been chosen by God for a higher purpose, his words dripping with the same religious rhetoric that had once comforted grieving families but now sounded like blasphemy from his lips. The priest admitted to taking Elena from the street that morning, claiming he had intended only to show her something important in the church basement, but that she had become difficult and resistant to his guidance. His voice never wavered as he described how Elena had threatened to tell her parents about their special meetings, how she had begun to understand the inappropriate nature of his attention, and how he had been forced to silence her to protect the church's reputation. The clinical way he spoke about Elena's final moments made Marcus's vision blur with rage, and he had to grip the edge of the table to keep from lunging at the old man. The basement of Father Mackenzie's apartment revealed the full extent of his crimes, a hidden chamber behind a false wall that contained photographs, children's belongings, and detailed journals documenting decades of abuse. Marcus's hands trembled as he opened boxes filled with evidence that would have solved not just Elena's case but dozens of others. Locks of hair, pieces of clothing, and Polaroid photographs that captured the terror in children's eyes. Father Mackenzie watched from the stairs as Marcus discovered Elena's red backpack, explaining with disturbing calm how he had kept it as a memento of their time together, how he had planned to mail it to the family eventually, but had never found the right moment. The priest's journal, written in Latin to avoid detection, detailed his methodical selection of victims, his grooming techniques, and his satisfaction at evading justice while being praised as a pillar of the community. Each page revealed a level of calculation and evil that made Marcus understand why some people believed in the existence of pure evil in the world. As Marcus called for backup and began to place Father Mackenzie under arrest, the priest's demeanor shifted from resignation to desperation, his mask of spiritual authority finally slipping to reveal the cornered predator beneath. He lunged toward a metal filing cabinet, frantically trying to destroy documents that would implicate other members of the church hierarchy who had known about his crimes and helped cover them up. The struggle was brief but violent, ending with Father Mackenzie on the floor, his elderly body no match for Marcus's training and years of pent-up rage. As sirens wailed in the distance and police cars surrounded the church, Marcus read Elena's diary one final time, focusing on the last entry where she had written about being excited to help Father Mackenzie with his important work. The innocence in those words contrasted with the horror of what Marcus had just discovered, crystallized the magnitude of the betrayal that had been perpetrated against his family and the entire community. The arrest of Father Mackenzie sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls, forcing longtime residents to confront the reality that they had unknowingly harbored a monster in their midst for decades. Marcus stood in the church parking lot, watching as evidence technicians carried boxes of damning materials to their vehicles, and he felt a complex mixture of relief and emptiness. Justice was finally being served, but it had come 30 years, too late for Elena and countless other victims. The church bells remained silent that day, their usual afternoon chimes replaced by the sound of police radios and the weeping of community members who realized how their blind faith had enabled unspeakable crimes. As Marcus drove home to tell his mother that Elena's killer had been caught, he wondered if the truth would bring them peace, or simply replace one form of suffering with another. The mountains of Colorado stood witness to the end of a decades-long nightmare, their peaks catching the last light of day as the sun set on Father Mackenzie's reign of terror and the beginning of a long process of healing and justice. The trial of Father Mackenzie became a media sensation that drew reporters from across the country to the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, transforming the quiet community into a battlefield between those who demanded justice and those who couldn't accept that their spiritual leader had been a predator. Marcus sat in the courtroom every day, watching as prosecutor Janet Williams methodically presented the evidence he had uncovered, each piece of testimony and documentation building an unshakable case against the priest who had hidden behind his collar for decades. The defense attorney, a slick lawyer hired by the Catholic diocese, attempted to paint Father Mackenzie as a confused old man whose mental state had deteriorated, but the meticulous records and photographs from his apartment told a different story. One of calculated evil and systematic abuse spanning 40 years. Sarah Martinez took the stand on the third day of the trial, her voice steady as she read from Elena's diary, the words of a trusting 9-year-old girl cutting through the courtroom, like a blade and bringing several jurors to tears. The media coverage was relentless, with cable news programs dissecting every aspect of the case and examining how an entire community had failed to protect its most vulnerable members. The most damaging testimony came from survivors who had been silent for decades, men and women in their 30s and 40s who found the courage to speak publicly about their experiences with Father Mackenzie during their childhood. Marcus watched as these brave individuals described the grooming process, the threats that had kept them silent, and the ways the priest had used their faith against them to ensure their compliance and silence. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a forensic psychologist, explained to the jury how Father Mackenzie had perfected a system of selecting isolated children from religious families, using the trust placed in him by parents and the authority of his position to gain access to his victims. The psychiatrist's testimony revealed that Elena's case was likely not Father Mackenzie's first murder, but rather the culmination of increasingly violent behavior that had been escalating for years. Phone records presented by the prosecution showed that Father Mackenzie had been in contact with other priests across the country, suggesting a network of predators who had been protecting each other and sharing information about potential victims. The defense's attempts to discredit the evidence crumbled when FBI forensics experts testified about the DNA found on Elena's backpack and the sophisticated analysis that had been conducted on the priest's personal effects. Crime scene investigators had discovered a hidden room beneath the church that contained additional evidence of Father Mackenzie's crimes, including a makeshift altar where he had performed blasphemous rituals that mixed religious symbolism with sexual abuse. The jury was visibly shaken as they viewed photographs of the underground chamber, its walls covered with religious iconography defaced with disturbing modifications that revealed the depth of Father Mackenzie's psychological disturbance. Marcus felt a savage satisfaction as he watched the priest's composure finally crack, his facade of dignity crumbling as the full scope of his crimes was exposed to the world. The community members who had supported Father Mackenzie throughout his career sat in stunned silence, many of them realizing that their donations and trust had enabled decades of abuse and murder. On the 7th day of the trial, Father Mackenzie's lawyer made a desperate attempt to negotiate a plea bargain, offering to reveal the locations of other victims' remains in exchange for a life sentence rather than the death penalty. The prosecutor rejected the offer, determined to see justice fully served, and the trial continued with testimony from law enforcement officials who had been involved in covering up the priest's crimes. Marcus listened with growing anger as corrupt officials described how they had been pressured by church hierarchy to minimize investigations and silence victims' families, revelations that implicated dozens of people in a conspiracy that had allowed Father Mackenzie to operate with impunity for decades. The courtroom erupted in chaos when one of the defense witnesses, a high-ranking church official, broke down under cross-examination and admitted that the diocese had known about Father Mackenzie's crimes since the 1970s, but had chosen to transfer him to Cedar Falls, rather than report him to authorities. The admission sparked protests outside the courthouse, with angry crowds demanding justice not just for Father Mackenzie, but for all the officials who had enabled his crimes. As the trial entered its final phase, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment, from the devastated child who had lost his sister to the determined detective who had finally unraveled the conspiracy that had destroyed his family. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies were compelling, and the jury seemed convinced of Father Mackenzie's guilt. But Marcus knew that no verdict could truly restore what had been taken from Elena and the other victims. The priest sat silently at the defense table, his hands folded in a mockery of prayer, occasionally glancing at the gallery where Sarah Martinez watched with eyes that held 30 years of grief and newfound hope for justice. As the closing arguments began, Marcus felt the weight of his sister's memory pressing down on him, and he made a silent promise that her death would not be in vain, that the truth revealed in this courtroom would prevent other children from suffering the same fate. The mountains of Colorado stood as silent witnesses to this moment of reckoning, their peaks catching the afternoon light as justice finally prepared to be served in the case that had haunted Cedar Falls for 3 decades. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict that sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. Guilty on all charges, including first-degree murder, multiple counts of child sexual abuse, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Marcus felt his mother's hand squeeze his as the foreman read the verdict, her tears flowing freely for the first time since Elena's disappearance 30 years ago. And he realized that this moment represented not just justice for his sister, but the beginning of healing for their entire family. Father Mackenzie showed no emotion as the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though several observers noted that his hands trembled slightly as he was led away in shackles. The man who had once commanded respect now exposed as the monster he had always been. The courtroom erupted in applause and tears, with survivors embracing each other and families of victims finding solace in the knowledge that their loved ones had finally received justice. Outside the courthouse, Marcus addressed the media gathered. On the steps, his voice carrying across the crowd as he dedicated the victory to Elena and all the other children who had suffered at Father Mackenzie's hands. The aftermath of the trial brought sweeping changes to Cedar Falls and the broader Catholic Church, with investigations launched into the diocese's cover-up and reforms implemented to prevent future abuse. Marcus returned to his mother's house that evening, finding Sarah in the kitchen where she had waited for Elena's return for 3 decades. But now the space felt different. Lighter somehow, as if a great weight had been lifted from the walls themselves. They sat together at the same table where Elena had eaten her last breakfast, and for the first time in 30 years, Sarah spoke about her daughter without the crushing weight of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. The red backpack sat on the counter, no longer a symbol of loss but rather a testament to the persistence of love and the inevitability of justice, and Marcus realized that Elena's memory would no longer be defined by the circumstances of her death, but by the courage her story had inspired in others. The church bells of Cedar Falls rang that evening for the first time since the trial began, their sound carrying across the valley not as a call to worship, but as a celebration of truth and justice finally revealed. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same church where Father Mackenzie had once preached. But now the building had been transformed into a community center, dedicated to protecting children and supporting survivors of abuse. The space that had once harbored evil now served as a beacon of hope, with counseling services, educational programs, and support groups that helped heal the wounds inflicted by decades of betrayal and violence. Sarah had become an advocate for other families of missing children, using her experience to guide others through the labyrinth of grief and the long journey toward acceptance and healing. The Elena Martinez Foundation, established with donations from across the country, funded programs that trained law enforcement officials to recognize signs of institutional abuse and empowered communities to protect their most vulnerable members. Marcus looked at the photographs lining the walls of the center, images of Elena and other victims whose stories had been silenced for too long, and he felt a profound sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for 3 decades. The final revelation came when investigators discovered Father Mackenzie's detailed records of his crimes, documents that led to the identification and recovery of 7 other victims whose families had never known their fate. Marcus participated in the ceremonies that laid these children to rest, standing alongside families whose grief mirrored his own, but who now had the closure that had eluded him for so long. The priest's arrest had triggered a domino effect that exposed corruption throughout the church hierarchy, leading to the resignation of bishops, the prosecution of officials who had covered up abuse, and reforms that would protect future generations of children. As Marcus watched Father Mackenzie being transferred to a maximum security prison, he felt no satisfaction in the old man's suffering, but rather a deep sense of completion. The circle of justice that had begun with Elena's disappearance had finally been closed. The mountains of Colorado stood as eternal witnesses to this transformation, their peaks catching the morning light as a new day dawned for the families and communities that had been touched by tragedy, but had found the strength to seek truth and demand accountability. In the end, Elena Martinez's story became more than a tale of loss and grief. It became a catalyst for change that rippled far beyond the small mountain town where she had lived and died. Marcus retired from law enforcement to run the foundation, in his sister's name, dedicating his life to the work Elena would have done if she had been given the chance to grow up and make her mark on the world. Sarah found peace in her faith, not the blind trust that had once made her vulnerable to manipulation, but a mature understanding of spirituality that embraced both divine love and human responsibility. The house in Cedar Falls became a place of pilgrimage for other families seeking justice. its kitchen table witnessing countless conversations about loss, hope, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us across time and death. As the years passed, the pain of Elena's absence never fully disappeared, but it transformed into something beautiful, a legacy of protection, advocacy, and love that ensured her brief life would continue to save others, long after her voice had been silenced. The mountains watched over it all, their ancient peaks holding the memory of a little girl who had skipped down a cobblestone path one morning in 1981, never knowing that her story would inspire a movement that would protect countless children and bring justice to those who had suffered in silence for far too long.